Well, thank you for coming today, everyone. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to particularly thank Dr. Pilipchuk and her team, Ashley and Hannah, who are, I think, still not nearby, but also Phoebe and Alice, who made sure all the technical support, and Carissa, who got the media release out, and also Chantel, who made sure we had goodies. I'd also like to thank Dr. Pilipchuk and her team because she's made sure that shelter voices, women's voices, and experiences are reflected in the work we're sharing today. And I want to congratulate her because she's just learned that one of her articles is being published in an ethics textbook in the United States. So I think that's pretty great. Before we begin, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the traditional lands upon which we live, work, and play. All Albertans are treaty people, and in ACWS we recognize we have a responsibility to understand our history so we can learn from the past, be aware of the future, and be aware of the present, and create a just and caring future. Our members serve all nations and all peoples and are located on Treaty 6, 7, and 8 lands across the province, which includes the 6 Métis nations of Alberta. First, a brief word to any survivors who are here or listening. You are not alone, and we are here for you. We believe you, and we've witnessed firsthand your strength, your resiliency, and determination to walk that path to healing, safety, and freedom from abuse. Some of the information that we're sharing today is difficult to hear, but please note, even when shelters are operating at capacity, they still do everything they can to help every survivor who reaches out. Before I go into the details of this year's data release, I want to share with you one of this weekend's news reports. A court case of a man who pled guilty to beating Amberstein to death 2 years ago. The court heard audio from the security system that included the high-pitched scream of a child. Her sister, Chantel, and her son, Wyatt, wanted people to know her name and declined a publication ban. Outside of the Edmonton courthouse, Chantel said, "Growing up, we lived in poverty. We lived a life of domestic violence. Growing up, it was mainly me and Amber. We lived on these streets, wandered these streets, literally, right here. We did what we could to be better than what we came from. Seeing all the domestic violence growing up, that's one thing she always had in her mind. She didn't want to become another number. She never wanted to become a statistic." So as we go into this year's data release, please know that these are much more than statistics. They are people's lives. Whole families experiencing violence, women who become homeless, children who live with the emotional scars for the rest of their lives, those who we see living on our streets. So into this year's data release. On the front lines, striving to end domestic violence and abuse together is bigger than ever. Not only do we share aggregated data from domestic violence shelters across Alberta, we are sharing the human stories behind the numbers. The numbers reveal some pretty sobering facts, but we also want to share with you the innovations and successes that give us hope. When you read the report, you'll find a few features. First, you'll find well-documented data we've become known for releasing year after year. It's gathered from 39 organizations operating 52 shelters in 30 different locations across Alberta. Second, you'll find we've included first-person accounts from shelters across the province. Feel free to use these stories for your reports or be in touch with us for contact information to support your reporting throughout these 16 days of action to end gender-based violence, and indeed throughout the year. Third, this report takes a deep dive into some of the trends shelters are reporting, like the lack of affordable housing and what the impact that it is having on survivors dealing with abuse. Finally, we have calls to action. We don't have the time now to talk about all of them, but we will highlight some of the most striking data and recurring themes. I have 4 shelter directors standing with me today representing shelters from big and medium-sized towns and cities. And we also have in the audience representatives from Edmonton Women's Shelters, Senior Safe House, and the Catholic Social Services. But when we share our remarks, I do want to highlight that this year is actually our 40th anniversary. And over the last 4 decades, ACWS has worked with our members to advocate for shelters and for survivors. We began collecting data 30 years ago, and since that time, women's shelters have served over 2 million vulnerable Albertans. We have also focused intently on creating a path to end domestic violence and abuse. While our education and training programs make a big impact, it's a long game to create a movement that will shift our culture to one where gender-based violence is no longer accepted or tolerated. Myself, I've been with ACWS for over 20 years, and the data from this report should rattle anyone. But the sobering numbers, however, are no surprise. It's reflective of experiences we hear from shelter staff on the ground every day. In 2023, shelters answered over 59,000 calls for help, a 10-year high. Another 10-year high, 42% of survivors surveyed said their partner tried to strangle them, one of the most significant predictors of future lethal violence. Strangulation actually increases the risk of being killed by 750%. And 40% of survivors surveyed said their partner had forced sex, a 10-year high. And while not a 10-year high, an alarming stat that shows domestic violence is trending in the wrong direction is that shelters who contributed to this report experienced a 19% spike in people requiring supports. The impact of domestic violence on children is also trending in the wrong direction. Almost half of those served by shelters and are children. And last year, the number of requests to bring children into the shelter, but that just could not happen, increased almost 50% from last year. I want to pause for a moment on this. The reason 50% more kids weren't able to get the safety and support they needed in shelter was simply because there was not enough space in the shelter. While shelters face these rising and more desperate needs, they are increasingly under budgetary pressures. Women's shelters' budgets have in fact had their purchasing power cut by 25%. These statistics, gathered carefully by shelters across the province, paint a sobering picture. But on the ground, there are also some reasons to celebrate. Shelters continue, whether there's space or not, to provide survivors with a wide range of services. And while my colleagues will present on this more, I want to emphasize that shelters do much more than simply provide a bed. They provide survivors with security plans, childcare supports, advocacy for permanent housing, connections to immigration and citizenship agencies, elder supports, transportation. Some have on-site health workers and other supports for education. They are more accurately a form of temporary supportive housing and must be a key part of the province's approach to housing and homelessness. The province took this approach in responding to elder abuse in rural and Indigenous communities just last week, and we applaud them. In fact, I think we lead Canada now in this approach to elder abuse. At its heart, this report celebrates the incredible work of these organizations and reveals just how much has been done to fill the gaps left by the affordable housing crisis, substance use services, and mental health supports. I'm now going to ask Marla Portzler from Morinville's Jessica Martel Memorial Foundation to speak a bit about the report and the services that their shelter provides that are more than a bed, and to give you an idea of how shelters support families who are experiencing sometimes brutal abuse from other family members that's not necessarily intimate partner violence.
Good morning, everybody. Jan, thank you very much for having me here today and hosting this very important event. I would like to start by telling you why the Jessica Martel Memorial Foundation exists. On April 29, 2009, Jessica Martel, a young mother of 3, was strangled to death in front of their 3 children by her partner in front of their 3 children. Jessica and her mother Lynn had worked together to create a plan for her to leave. Unfortunately, she tragically lost her life on the same day she was supposed to create a new start. Lynn and her family, along with the support of the community, established the Jessica Martel Memorial Foundation in 2012 to help people like Jessica escape their situation. The foundation works towards breaking the cycle of domestic violence through the actions of advocacy, community engagement, awareness, education, and safe housing at Jesse's House, a 35-bed all-gender emergency shelter that opened in May of 2020, and Eileen's Place, a transitional second-stage housing program that's scheduled to open in early 2024. Jesse's House is not just a bed. It is a home and a place of healing for people who have experienced control, financial, spiritual, emotional abuse, isolation, physical and sexual violence, and are at high risk of homicide. Many of the people we help have been deprived of their dignity and the basic needs a human requires to thrive, such as access to the medical system, prescriptions, food, dental care, and employment. This equates to 75% of the people who access services, one of the key findings in the report. If you were to imagine for a moment what a home should be, what do you think of? How do you want to feel? What do you want to smell? And what do you want to hear? You feel welcome, healthy, safe, supported, rested, loved, warm, nourished, happy, connected, and hopeful. You hear laughter and joy, everything we all deserve to experience. This is what people can experience at Jesse's House and through our other programs. During their stay, we meet people where they are at through goal planning. The most common goal we hear is safe, affordable housing, which seems pretty simple, right? But it's not. Affordable housing is hands down one of the most significant barriers to survivors leaving their abusers for good. And when I say affordable, I mean truly affordable, and sometimes that means subsidized housing. Another key finding in the report is that 76% of survivors surveyed experienced moderate to high barriers in accessing safe, affordable housing. Although 98% of the people who access shelter services identify as women, abuse does not discriminate. So today I will be sharing a story about a male who is a survivor of family violence. Ben is a single father of 3. One of his children has severe disabilities. Ben came to Jesse's House because he was experiencing financial, emotional, and physical abuse at home. Ben has work experience, but finds it difficult to maintain consistent employment because of his responsibility to care for his child with disabilities. For now, he relies on income support through Alberta Works. Ben is a good dad who worked hard during his stay at Jesse's House to provide for his children. Ben's biggest challenge? Safe, affordable housing. Ben's monthly budget was $3,200 a month. Ben was looking for a 3-bedroom home. 3-bedroom apartments can start around $1,400 a month plus utilities. This would have left Ben with $1,800 to provide the necessities for him and his children. We established a rental budget with Ben of $1,200 all in. Looking for a home was a daily task for Ben. After almost 40 days, an increase to his original rental budget, and over 20 viewings, Ben found a place. He was in Jesse's House for over 2 months. When a family struggles to find housing, they need to stay at Jesse's House longer. Sometimes they make the decision to go back. The other impact of this is when a family stays longer, it means we cannot admit new people who are in crisis because we are at capacity. While we may not be able to bring them into Jesse's house or put them in a hotel because there are no hotels in Morinville, we do offer support through our outreach program. Outreach works towards understanding their situation a little more. Goal planning, danger assessments, safety planning, referrals to other support services, and staying in touch for when a space becomes available if this is still required. This support helps people continue their plan to leave and at the very least provides hope. Thank you for listening to me today. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Linda McLean of Strathmore's domestic violence shelter, True North, to speak about what our collective data is telling us about domestic abuse survivors in rural communities, as well as other marginalized communities.
Thank you, Marla, and thank you, Jan. I'm just gonna, I don't have a place. Is it disappeared here? Thank you. Marla described what is most definitely a major systemic barrier facing survivors leaving domestic abuse, the lack of housing. It's nothing short of a crisis. Systemic barriers go beyond that. They tend to be more varied and even more heightened for survivors from communities that have experienced marginalization and oppression, including those coming from Indigenous, Black, people of color communities, newcomers, immigrants, refugees, and those from the 2S LGBTQ+ communities. And shelters tend to see a higher percentage of these communities in need of support. For instance, of those survivors surveyed by Shelter, 61.5% reported experiencing moderate to high exposure to systemic oppression and marginalization. How does systemic oppression and marginalization impact survivors' ability to leave their abuser? Well, every story is unique, but I'd like to share one. A young mother coming from another part of this wonderful planet through an arduous path, fled her country of origin after a forced marriage at the age of 13 to an incredibly violent, abusive partner, gave birth at the age of 14, saw rampant violence perpetrated against women in her home community. She was able to flee after witnessing her sister raped and killed in front of her, and found safety in a neighboring country where she became engaged in exploitation that led to her being trafficked to Canada, first to Montreal and ultimately to Calgary, where she was abandoned by those who had trafficked her and her daughter into the country. She arrived to our shelter after being picked up by emergency services in distress, literally on the street with her child, and entered our shelter after a hospital social worker identified the extent of the impact of domestic violence and abuse in her life. So now we have an incredibly complex situation. A woman with uncertain immigration status in the country at incredible risk, fears being attacked if she returns to her country of origin, clearly, fears being attacked if she seeks housing in Calgary because those individuals who trafficked her are still present in her life, has no source of income, no rights to health care, very limited English, and is really facing just an incredibly uphill battle to find even the basics of safety and the right to life. So that's just an example of the complexity of that systemic marginalization that's happening and what we're up against. We also, I think, face a lot of despair. In her most recent counseling session, this young woman shared with our staff that she doesn't believe it's possible to ever be able to support herself or move forward in her life without a man attached to her. She has no other framework to imagine a life going forward. She's known only oppression, violence, and terror because she's a vulnerable Black woman. She believes there will be no other reality for her and her daughter. But we're committed to changing that story. And that's where we come in. And that's what our real role is in changing that trajectory, changing that ending of that story. Of the over 8,400 individuals who stayed in shelters, almost 2,000, almost 25% were newcomers, and this number is growing. We have a global diaspora, and many, many people are seeking safety and refuge in Canada. This means that our shelters are going to need to be prepared a little differently. Where once upon a time we didn't need the services of interpreters, we do daily now. We need interpreters and translators. We need staff and we need supports that really are able to provide those cultural supports that reflect an understanding of the realities of the people that we're serving. For newcomers and immigrants and refugees to Canada, the experience of domestic violence and abuse comes with unique complexities. Often, abusers will use the language barriers, the limited social connections, the lack of natural supports, and the lack of understanding of rights and laws that can come with moving to a new country to maintain isolation and control their partners. If the abuser is also the sponsor, newcomer survivors worry that leaving their abuser could jeopardize their own and their children's status in Canada, and they often decide it is safer to remain in the abusive relationship than risk deportation to their country of origin. Newcomer survivors who do reach out for support experience increased systemic barriers, and they have to navigate what is a very complex immigration system, as well as all the gaps in services and supports for newcomers that are not particularly culturally informed. For newcomer survivors with precarious status, these systemic barriers are even greater, as they may be ineligible for many of the supports that survivors rely upon during their journeys. There's another trend we see that as a shelter director for one of the many rural shelters that ACWS represents that I want to highlight. Individuals, predominantly women, who live in a rural or remote location face far greater danger than their urban counterparts when suffering abuse. The data shows that survivors living in smaller towns and rural areas experience the greatest danger, with 73% of survivors who were surveyed being at severe or extreme danger of being killed. More generally, women and girls living in rural, remote, and northern communities experience an increased risk and rate of violence. The rates of intimate partner violence for rural women are 75% higher than the rates for urban women. But it continues. Research tells us that young women and girls in northern communities are killed at more than 3 times the rate of young women and girls in urban communities. These rates of deadly violence are particularly high for Indigenous women. They represent 76% of all young femicide victims in northern Canada. Older adults living in rural areas experience increased risk as well. The rates of family violence against older adults are 45% higher in rural areas than in urban areas. Survivors in rural, remote, and northern communities also experienced increased barriers to reaching out for and receiving support and service. They are less likely to have access to reliable cell phone reception or internet, making it harder to call for help. If they do, or when they do reach out for help, they face incredible barriers, including transportation challenges that make it hard to reach supports and resources. And they often have no choice but to rely on high-risk travel options, such as hitchhiking or navigating their way in unsafe weather. If there are complex factors associated with their experience of violence or abuse, the supports and services in their communities likely will not meet their needs. And they may be required, forced really, to travel considerable distances or even give up their community and relocate in order to find the help they need. As a director of a shelter based in rural Alberta, this reflects the daily experience of our clients and our staff. I also celebrate the recent provincial government announcement for additional funding supports for seniors in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. But I also encourage the government to work with ACWS and its members to consider going beyond simply funding the unfunded beds. We also need to consider the resources necessary for our unique transportation needs, technology supports, and health-related needs for rural community shelters. I'd now like to call on my colleague Kathy Collins from Wings of Providence in Edmonton to speak about the important research findings in our report related to children. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Linda, and thank you everybody for being here today. At Wings, our second stage shelter has 20 2- and 3-bedroom apartments where women and children stay for an average of 6 to 8 months, while participating in a variety of programs and accessing a number of on-site wraparound services. I think we've heard here that it's well known domestic violence is not just a pathway to homelessness, it's a runway. That's why we also provide 29 subsidized 2- and 3-bedroom apartments at our home next door, as finding housing for women leaving second stage shelters has been an ongoing challenge. So several years ago, our board stepped up to this challenge and opened a home next door where families stay and are provided support and services for up to an additional 2 years. We know increasing the length of time families are in safe housing with fulsome professional and supportive services increases the likelihood that these families will be successful when they move on to total independence and lives free of violence. We also know that children are deeply affected when they're exposed to domestic violence. In fact, as Jan pointed out last year, almost half of all the stays in the shelter were by children. Almost half. And at Wings, approximately 2/3 of our residents are children. We offer programs and services for children and youth of all ages at Wings. We have childcare spaces in both programs, which is critical to the healing from the trauma of domestic violence. Children at Wings are safe, they learn, engage, and they play in a trauma-informed daycare, allowing moms their time to heal while participating in a variety of programs. Jan had mentioned shelters collectively saw admissions rise by 19% from last year. Collectively, 8,483 survivors were sheltered. 3,561 of this total were children. That is more than the entire population of a small town in Alberta. It is the student population of Ross Shepherd and McNally High Schools in Edmonton combined, and these are only the children that the shelters see. What we observe at Wings is the resiliency of these children. They often initially come to our program scared, withdrawn, and within a few weeks we see a wonderful transition to active, engaged, and happy kids living free of violence in a supportive, safe environment. It makes a huge difference. ACWS has created an online resource known as the Healing Brain, which allows our child care staff to better understand the unique ways the children in their care need support. The training teaches about the impacts of trauma on the brain. Research shows that kids who have experienced family violence are more likely to experience domestic violence when they are older, and in the absence of therapeutic support, sometimes to perpetrate it. This course trains caregivers to support kids to heal from their trauma. With the right relationships and support, these kids can break the silence of intergenerational family violence. And this is a critical component of family violence prevention. Children are the future, and domestic violence shelters focus a significant amount of time and resources to support these young survivors of domestic abuse. I'm just going to leave you, we're all on the same page with my final comment. We want safe communities, and they're made up of safe and healthy families with healthy children and healthy brains. And I call upon my colleague Ian Williker of Red Deer Central Alberta Outreach Society to close on a positive note.
Thanks, Kathy. Our second stage shelter in Red Deer called Giletta's Place has 10 apartments and serves a population of approximately 100,000 people. While the numbers presented today in this report expose many sobering realities about domestic violence and abuse, with this report we also aim to spotlight innovation in the sector. Marla, Kathy, and Linda have all shared about the services sheltered offers beyond the very basic roof over survivors' heads. While we do meet the survivors in the most critical times of emergencies, we also support survivors in the healing journey. We support them in the shelter, and we support them after they leave for up to a year, in some cases beyond a year. In so many ways, this has been a year of successes. In 2022-23, almost half, 45%, of survivors who left domestic violence shelters successfully completed the shelter program and met all of their goals. Now, 1 in 2 may not seem like a great number, of survivors, but for them to successfully complete their program results in being thousands of women who have accessed our shelter. With supports, we're seeing half of all survivors complete the programs, and that again translates into thousands of success stories. And even more have made small steps in the right direction thanks to the support they received from shelters. This year, 81% of survivors who were surveyed made progress in at least one of their major goals. Just one word on these successes. Often the goals survivors in shelters make are much bigger than the shelter can control. Their goals are often outside of our shelter's control or even the survivor's control. They have goals in areas like the legal system, child welfare, income support, and housing. So when they aren't able to meet all of their goals, there can be reasons beyond their control and beyond their intent. Shelters are taking a great deal of initiative to flex with the needs and the goals of survivors. For instance, one of our clients recently interviewed listed the areas that she had seen success in and the things she had accomplished during and just after her stay at Gilletta's Place. She reported that the services that she received and the growth that she experienced while she was with us gave her a sense of purpose. She started volunteering. She said that she learned things about herself that she had not realized before. She's able to heal and to work through counseling. She's learning how to be herself again in her own home and outside of JP's. And importantly, she's learning how to put the past behind her and how to move on. Collectively, we have also worked to think about the long term, to challenge the big cultural norms that lead to gender inequality. ACWS's Leading Change program is engaging men and boys more than ever before to be national leaders against gender-based violence. Last year, our tailored gender-based violence prevention training influenced over 7,500 individuals. Participants included athletes, health and safety professionals, theater artists, and more. Within that work, a total of over 30 sessions were completed, and Leading Change provided 461 sessions, had 461 participants in sessions from the Alberta Junior Hockey League. Players learned the tools they need to begin leading change and to end domestic violence and contribute to that larger cultural shift. I'm very proud to be part of a sector that cares so much and that has shown that it can be flexible and creative while doing the essential work of supporting survivors at sometimes their most difficult times of their lives. To conclude, I invite our Executive Director, Jan Reimer, back to the mic.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, everyone, for sharing the work that you're doing on the front lines. And I hope everyone shares these experiences widely. We'd like to thank government for supporting our work in collecting this data and working with our members to ensure that it presents a fulsome picture of our shelter experiences. The report itself is made possible in large part by donations from the community, and we thank our community donors for supporting this vital work. We hope that, like us, you find strength in the stories of innovation and collaboration and hope from the front lines. At ACWS, we know that transformational learning is key to ending gender-based violence in the long term, as is building allies with men and boys. But transformational change will only occur if we work together to break down the barriers to affordable housing, the barriers to transportation, to mental health services, to supports for our diverse communities. This takes innovation, which we're doing, collaboration, also, which we're doing, and hope, which we have. And it will also take funds to ensure domestic violence shelters can continue to do the important work that they do. We are happy to partner with all levels of government, for instance, with the City of Edmonton, who provided funds for those with precarious immigration status, as well as providing mental health, cultural, and nursing supports for Edmonton shelters with great impact. Another example was the federal government, who funded our Blueprint project to show how we can share information for the betterment of survivors, and our legal education training, which has seen more than 300 lawyers trained to better understand and represent survivors of domestic violence. And stay tuned, we actually have a documentary coming out on this. We'd also like to thank the government of Alberta and grateful for the work that the Ministry of Seniors, Community and Social Services and the Ministry of Children and Family Services, we were split and moved around a little bit, have continued in terms of funding our members, and we want to work with them to end gender-based violence. We also want to encourage government to follow through on their campaign promise to increase funding to women's shelters prorated to the inflation that we've been experiencing, and work with us to implement the National Action Plan, which are dollars that are coming from the federal government. But what is it going to take to stop this violence besides immediate funding? We need to address gender inequality that is at the core of this violence, as well as to change the attitudes, the beliefs, and behaviors that manifest itself in gender-based violence. We need to challenge the community attitudes and social norms that tolerate and condone it, and encourage everyone to check in with family and friends who they think might be at risk. And we need to make sure that this risk is picked up as early as possible and addressed as soon as possible, as well as ensuring that there are specialist services that are strong and well funded in order to respond and help people in violent situations. But to be sure this happens, however, as one of my colleagues in the sector said, we need our leaders to feel the outrage that we do and to put this issue to the highest political and administrative agendas for consideration. Because without this agenda and what we need will never be addressed and be given the attention that it so deserves. With further partnership, we know we can make a huge difference. Our members will be better able to serve survivors and the children who walk through their doors so that they can find a future that is healthy, happy, and safe. So that is our presentation this morning. Thank you all for listening and seeing the multiple different ways in which shelters work. We'd be pleased to answer any questions. Well, I think it's really the impact we're seeing on children, and that spike, we're seeing larger families. We're seeing the challenge of bringing children into shelter when they so need to be. And I think as well, just that we're seeing so many things trending in the wrong direction. We really need to get a handle on this, and that means making sure there are those supports for survivors. Well, we first of all need to stabilize our sector. I mean, it's been buffeted by the winds of inflation, by COVID, by so many different things. And just to even address the inflationary pressures, you imagine having to buy food for everyone in the shelter, paying for your insurance, transporting people, always difficult, but now even more difficult. So our first priority is certainly to see that we can keep our heads above water and address the inflationary pressures, and then also work with government to move forward on funding unfunded beds and the services like Linda described in terms of meeting the significant needs that are out there.
It's untenable. And it's, when Jen talks about the critical need to stabilize our sector, a lot of that also has to do with making it a safe space for the people who work in this sector. It's not safe psychologically to answer a phone every day and tell people no, and know and hear that absolute panic on the other end of the line. We're losing our newest and brightest graduates from our helping professions disciplines because it's taking this kind of toll on them. And then you add insult to injury by not paying a living wage and having many of our staff basically facing the same crises related to housing and affordability that our clients are. So yeah, it's untenable. I would invite any of our esteemed representatives in office to join us on the crisis lines for a few shifts.
Yeah, so I guess with an emergency shelter or first stage shelter, generally like an average length of stay would be anywhere from like 21 days to 30 days. And because people are finding it harder and harder to find affordable homes, people are staying in shelter anywhere from 40 days. So I shared a story about a gentleman that was with us for over 40 days because it took him a really long time to find a home. And we're seeing people staying with us for up to 4 months. And for us to being out in Morinville, there really isn't a lot of options directly in Morinville. So a lot of people that are coming to us are going into Edmonton or having to travel a little bit farther to find a home. So, I mean, it does obviously create a lot of challenges, and we're finding that people are having to increase their rental budgets in order to find somewhere that's safe, because some of the areas that they're looking at aren't really overly that safe for children, or they might not be close to a school that they need to access or the supports that they might need to access. So then that creates some financial strain for families. So then they're accessing, the food bank because they can't afford to feed their children. So that creates strain. And sometimes people unfortunately make the decision to go back because they find it so stressful, to just go out on their own. So that's really hard for shelter staff and for our staff when, you work really hard to work with somebody and they just feel so hopeless, right, that they decide to go back. So that's obviously puts people at a risk of going back into abusive situations, and then it increases the risk of homicide. Yeah, we're really excited for Eileen's Place. So it's taken us about 2 years to get to this point. So Eileen's Place, thankful to a donor, which is why it's named Eileen's Place, we received a $700,000 donation from a member in the community so that we could buy a property in Morinville. So it's a three-bedroom triplex. So we'll be able to house up to 3 families at a time. It's opening early, like January 2024 is our goal. And we referred, so last year we referred over 100 people into second stage housing facilities. So Wings is one of our big referrals, and we also work with Red Deer as well. So it's really nice for us to be able to keep people within Morinville. We find when people come into Jesse's house, they really like the community and often want to stay. So this is going to give them an opportunity to stay in the community and get those extra supports that they need, and obviously have a safe home that is subsidized. So Eileen's Place is subsidized rent as well. So we're really excited for that.
Yeah, long term in Wings, because we're fortunate to have the progressive housing, so they can move to a house that takes them 2 or 3 years beyond, and has daycare. So usually we've connected them with a lot of community supports to assist in housing programs for their children. A lot of our children in care require a lot more services than in regular daycares, just to deal with that trauma and some of the additional stresses that go along with that. So we're always looking for additional services in the community to come into our center and help, as well as strong referrals outside. Yeah, it's horrible. There's no other way to describe it. And I think because shelters running logs, so you see every morning, you read your logs and you read how many people phoned. We're second stage, so we're usually referring to emergency. And they may be saying to us, well, I've already called emergency. And so, yeah, it causes stress, as Leslie identified, to our workers when you have to say no to people, when you know they're in critical situations. It's really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with distance from supports. So, getting to safety is a major barrier. Often, if you don't have your own vehicle, you are out of luck in a lot of cases, unless you can barter for a ride, which may be unsafe, unless you're going to hitchhike, which is incredibly unsafe. We don't live in Palm Springs. Our climate doesn't support walking great distances. So that's a huge one. I would say that the other major concerning factor is that once people are physically safe in our shelter and able to access our supports, they have limited access to other comprehensive supports in community. So if you need anything of a nature complex physically in terms of your physical health care, you're often having to travel great distances to a larger municipality to access those. If your children have complex health needs, you're definitely traveling to a larger municipality to access that. And again, if you don't have a vehicle, how is that happening? Anyone who's had to navigate a healthcare system knows that appointments run long, there's long wait times. You don't have the luxury of turning down an appointment if it pops up. And so being able to get there, I mean, I've got clients who are spending $80 on a taxi ride one way to get to an appointment for their child. That's commonplace. Housing, obviously exiting to community housing is much more challenging in rural or remote areas where there isn't any much option. We are in crisis in our large municipalities right now in terms of affordable housing, and our social housing, it has wait lists of years, not months. So compound that by the even more limited stock in rural and remote communities. There's nowhere to exit to. I have a family in house right now that has been moving from shelter to shelter for 18 months. 3 children under the age of 7. 2 of those children have never set foot in a school, because we're also unable to register them in school in the rural areas because the school divisions can't support it unless they're a permanent resident and have an address. So that is going to create long-term systemic costs for all of us because the children's path ahead has already been dramatically compromised because we just don't have the resources and supports in our region. And then, you drill down further. Why should a woman have to choose safety and give up her community? Why do you have to give up your community, all of your connections and all of your history in order to have a life free of violence? That's the reality. We are telling people every day, get yourself into Calgary, get yourself on a wait list for Calgary housing because we don't have an option for you. That's the reality. Thanks.